Russia has launched an all-out invasion of Ukraine by land, air and sea, the largest assault that Europe has witnessed since the Cold War. Let's now talk about the cost involved in this war. What's at stake? In this crisis, Ukraine has been suffering consequences. The talk of war was already costing Ukrainian economy $3 billion a month, according to reports, since the beginning of the crisis. The national currency has steadily lost value. Ukraine says around $12.5 billion have been withdrawn from accounts in the country. The members of parliament and businessmen are fleeing. So the impact on the economy could carry long-standing consequences, one that the West has been trying to neutralize with aids and loans. As for Russia, it is the top oil and natural gas producer. The most effective way to target Moscow with sanctions is to cut off its supply of oil and natural gas to the West. What are the other ways? Excluding Russia from SWIFT, that's the global banking system, banning Russia from using the US dollar, blacklisting banks and sanctioning its oligarchs. While all these sanctions could cripple the Russian economy, it will also hurt the West. It could mean higher energy costs for both America as well as Europe. Currently, oil prices surging past $100 a barrel. That's for the first time since 2014. Even Russia does not want oil to get pricier. Russia's inflation currently stands at 8%. A further increase in the price of oil will push up prices in other sectors as well. As for the rest of the world, it means more disruptions, more supply chain issues, more market volatility, and more oil price hikes. Russia is a major exporter of rare earth minerals used in airplanes and converters, for example. Ukraine, on the other hand, is a major source of neon used in making semiconductors. Both countries also produce major quantities of fertilizers. It's safe to say then what happens in Ukraine will impact all parts of the world and carry far-reaching implications. For more on these developments, joining us on the broadcast is Dr Marcus Papadopoulos. He is a historian, analyst and author specializing in Russia and the former Soviet Union. Also with us is Dr. Anna Matvieva. She is a Russian affairs analyst based out of London. Thanks very much for being here with us. Let me come to you first, Marcus. What, according to you, is the meaning now of the pledges of support, the statements of condemnation coming in from the West, from the NATO, the European Union, now that the Russian attack is already underway?
Allow me to say, first of all, that what the world is witness to in Ukraine is 100% the fault of the United States of America. For 30 years now, I repeat, for 30 years now, Russia has asked, told, warned America to not extend its tentacles to Ukraine because Ukraine is imperative to Russian national security and Ukraine is an integral part of the Russian national identity. But alas, because of America's insatiable lust for more and more power in the world, Russia was forced to take military action in Ukraine. And let me say as well that vast parts of the Ukrainian population, especially in the east, in the north, in the south, and in the center of the country, do not regard Russia as an alien country. Vast parts of the Ukrainian population regard Russia as a fraternal country. They regard themselves as a part of the Russian world. The Western mainstream media has been peddling an atrocious lie about Ukraine, saying that Russia is regarded in Ukraine as an alien country, which is an absolute grotesque falsehood. But as I said, Russia was left with no choice but to launch a military operation in Ukraine. Russia tried all diplomatic means for 30 years to avert what we are seeing now in Ukraine. But the Americans were not at all interested. And the Americans went even further when they engineered a coup in Kiev in February of 2014 against a democratically elected Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, whose election victory in 2010 was recognized by both the European Union and America. And why did the Americans engineer a coup against Yanukovych? Because he chose to pursue economic integration with the Russian-led Eurasian Union as opposed to integration with the European Union. So again, what we see unfolding in Ukraine is the result of America's just this insatiable desire to preserve and extend its global hegemony. And they are trying to do that at the expense of Russian national security.
Dr. Matviva, if I can bring you in here, do you agree with that view, first of all?
Not entirely, because there is some truth in it, but there is also the truth that solving problems which are politically and diplomatically at the expense of human security of Ukrainian people living now is probably not the good way of conducting international affairs. What I would say that the West is talking now more about how to punish Russia rather than how to stop bloodshed. And that is unfortunate. I would say that the West should concentrate their efforts to reach a ceasefire now and stop violence, and then create an atmosphere where, yes, Russian concerns would be taken seriously. The West has called Putin's bluff. He thought that what he was raising concerns, which the West thought were really not very significant, but it did look to the Russian leadership that it's actually very significant. So he thought that Putin is bluffing. He was not, so they called his bluff. We are now seeing the consequences, and they will certainly, of course, would be the most painful for Ukraine. And there we should be really putting our concerns into.
Right, but this Russian attack has happened despite those warnings coming in from the West, despite several rounds of diplomatic efforts. How do you now assess their potential to protect Ukraine? How optimistic are you that they will be going beyond statements of condemnation?
I think that they need to start offering Russia some real answers to its concerns. That would be something which President Putin wants the West to hear. Russia has two goals in Ukraine right now, and we are looking probably today at fairly short-term scenario of how these goals would be realized. One is tactical, and this is to do with the so-called republics of LNI and DNI in Donetsk and Lugansk provinces to push the line of contact further away from the populated areas which have been in the line of artillery bombardments of Ukrainian army. Civilian casualties, 80% of them have been sustained within the self-proclaimed republics. So there is a tactical goal to push the line of contact further away, and that's where we see quite a lot of infantry fighting, mostly of the self-proclaimed militias, but supported with the Russian artillery. So that's a very kind of tangible goal. And the other goal is geopolitical, to give a signal to the West that we are opposing NATO expansion. We mean it seriously, and we also oppose Anglo-Saxon attempts to turn Ukraine into potential military garrison with unclear but probably not very friendly intentions. And that's where the negotiations should really start right now, with some serious concessions and serious kind of rethinking of European security, rather than putting more sanctions, which, frankly speaking, in that situation are really not very much valid as a deterrence.
Right. Marcus, what do you make of the Russian claim, specifically now coming in from the foreign minister, even as those attacks continue, that Moscow is always ready for dialogue and has maintained that position?
Well, Russia has been open to dialogue with the United States of America about Ukraine and NATO expansion in general for 30 years now. But I believe that we have now reached a point after 3 decades in which Russia feels only military action on the ground is going to avert a catastrophe for Russian national security, because the tension in the world today between America and Russia revolves around NATO expansionism. NATO expansionism, something which was told to Mikhail Gorbachev by Western leaders in 1990, would not occur. Indeed, the then American Secretary of State, James Baker, told Gorbachev not 1 inch eastwards of NATO expansion will occur. But Gorbachev, being the useless leader that he was, did not get the Americans to put it into writing. So fast forward to the present day, Russia has to take action to make sure that Ukraine never becomes a member of NATO. Because in a scenario where Ukraine is a member of NATO, Russia will be completely encircled on its western border by NATO member states, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. And let us remember that NATO is a villainous and expansionist power. When it bombed the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1999, it didn't just violate international law by doing so. It violated its own founding treaty, the North Atlantic Treaty, Article 1, which states that NATO will never use force to resolve a dispute. NATO action in Libya also turned Libya into a failed state. NATO actions in Afghanistan resulted in the deaths of untold numbers of Afghan civilians. NATO support to Islamist terrorists in Syria, principally Al-Qaeda and ISIS, resulted in untold numbers of civilian deaths. And yet today we hear American and British leaders saying that NATO is a force for good in the world, that NATO is a peaceful military bloc. That is inversion at its most inverted. Ask Serbs, ask Libyans, ask Afghans, ask Syrians to see what they think of NATO.
Right. Dr. Matviva, if I can ask you to also comment on the American president's strategy at this point. Now, he will be meeting with the G7 allies to hammer out a raft of fresh sanctions against Russia, even if those are harsher measures. What impact do you think they will have now?
Russia expects sanctions. So they have been analyzing the potential sanctions and the impact, and they think that with the alliance with China and with their own resources, they can perhaps withstand that. It will make Russian economy probably slow down in a way that it will be more expensive to buy goods and technologies, because they cannot buy them directly, but they have to buy it through third parties. But it's not something which would kind of ruin the economy. Sanctions would be quite often met by the population rather than by the government. They have money in the coffers. So, yes, it will be unpleasant, but unless the West is prepared not to buy oil and gas from Russia and not to use its rare metals and other things which only Russia can supply, that sanctions would still continue having limited impact, given Russia's own vast resources and quite responsible and prudent macroeconomic management. But people's sanctions would be the worst. It would be more cutting off Russian people, Russian scholars, intellectuals, journalists, cultural figures, sports figures. I think that would be a more kind of sad effects of what we are going to see. So impact on kind of Russian people perception of the West and Russian people integration into European culture would be, in my view, quite sad.